Affairs, and I would like to welcome you to the public discussion by the Latvian Institute of International Affairs called Which Future for the European Security and Defense? And without further delay, I would like to invite Madame Odile Cipizon, the Ambassador of France to Latvia, to give the opening remarks. So, Ambassador, welcome.
So, Madam Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Parliamentary Secretary, Your Excellencies, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to open this panel discussion this afternoon on the future of the European defense and security. The event today in the EU House is a result of a joint effort between the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, the Embassy of Estonia in Latvia, acting as the presidency of the European Union, the embassies of Germany and France in Latvia, the Friedrich Ebert Institute and the French Stiftung, and the French Institute in Latvia. First of all, I would like to thank all participants in the two panel discussions of this afternoon, especially the parliamentary secretaries of the two ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense of Latvia, and the experts coming from different European countries, from Estonia, Finland, France, and Germany, and coming from the European External Service in Brussels. And I would like also to thank you, the European delegation in Latvia, for accepting to host this event this afternoon. Why did we decide altogether to organize such a public discussion on the future of the European defense and security? If this question of defense, of European defense and security, has been on the table for many years, it has become more sensitive in the last few years, especially in the last few months, because of the main challenges all countries have to face regarding their security. As we commemorate today the second anniversary of one of the main terrorist attacks in Paris, it is essential to ensure the security of European citizens. So, in a rapidly changing international environment, European countries and European citizens have to face the same issues regarding security and defense and the future of Europe. In Warsaw, in July 2016, both President of the European Council, President of the European Commission, and Secretary General of NATO signed a joint declaration to step up the efforts of EU and NATO in order to provide better security in Europe and beyond. The issues of defense and security are regularly debated both in NATO and in the EU, and they made part of the discussions in the Bratislava and Rome summits. Today, the permanent structured cooperation is one of the subjects in the agenda of the Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels. The President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said in September in his State of the Union Address 2017 that by 2025 we need a fully fledged European Defence Union. He added, we need it and NATO wants it. He said that the European Union must be stronger in fighting terrorism, and he added he wanted the Union to become a stronger global actor and to dedicate further efforts to defense matters. So, the future of the European defense and security is a complex issue in relation both with defense, security, and future of Europe. While all European leaders are calling for more dialogue with citizens, this issue remains for many people a theoretical debate around some main concepts. That's why we thought altogether that it could be interesting to have a discussion on this subject in order not to explain one or another national position, but to try to answer some simple questions, such as what is exactly the European defense and security, and more important, what is the European defense and what the European defense and security is not. What is European defense and security in relation to NATO defense? Third question, what is NATO doing that EU can do? What could EU do that NATO can't do? And last, what's the place of the European defense and security in the debate of the future, on the future of Europe? These are some questions that could be discussed in the two panels around the internal dimension and the external dimension of security and defense in the EU, with two moderators from LIA, Maurice Hansens and Edith Boss. Before I give them the floor, I would like to reiterate my gratitude to all the participants to these panels and to Latvian Institute of International Affairs for organizing this discussion today. Thank you very much, and have a nice discussion.
Yes, thank you, Madam Ambassador, for the encouragements for the discussion. We'll try to keep this lively and interesting. So, before we kick off, I would like to remind that there was a very famous quote in 1991 when the Belgian foreign minister said and compared the European Union as a political dwarf, economic giant, and military worm. And it's quite clear that it is, the European Union is not yet a military giant, and it's likely that it will never be so, at least for the foreseeable future, but it's probably also not anymore a military worm. And we will try to address different issues, and in the first panel we will focus on the internal dimension. Of course, it is always quite difficult to dismantle issues so that they fit in internal and external, but we will try to do our best. And for that we have four excellent panelists today, and I would like to introduce them. And first of all, on my left we have Dr. Hans-Peter Bartels, who comes from Germany. He is the Commissioner of Armed Forces in the Bundestag and the German Parliament, and previously, since 1998, he was also a member of Bundestag, and he served in many committees, also the Defense Committee. And Dr. Bartels is also editor of the book about the strategic autonomy that we were also promoting as a part of this discussion. So welcome, Dr. Bartels. Next we have Mr. Vasilij Silenieks, who is the Parliamentary Secretary of the Ministry of Defense of Latvia. So he has quite an extensive CV, and he has been the head of the office of the Prime Minister, and he has been advisor to the Speaker of the Parliament, and has held many posts, and he's well known in Latvia for promoting also the green lifestyle. So welcome, Mr. Silenieks. Next we have Dr. Mika Aaltola, who represents the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He is the director of the Global Security Research Program at the Institute, and he's a very well-known expert in Finland and beyond. He comments on almost everything that happens on the international scale. So welcome, Dr. Aaltola. And last but not least, we have Ingvar Pärnamäe from Estonia. So he's the chairman of the Estonian Defense Industry Association. And this association represents the main stakeholders in Estonia that are producing things in the defense and security related domains. And before that, Mr. Pärnamäe was Undersecretary in the Ministry of Defense for also defense investment issues. And it's also something I have to note that quite so many years ago you were a member of the parliament, also Estonia. I understand you must have been one of the youngest members of the parliament of Estonia. So he finished his tenure as a member of the parliament 15 years ago. So warm welcome from Latvia to Estonia, and I think with this we can kick off with the debate, and I would like to give the floor for Dr. Hans-Peter Bartels. So each speaker will have approximately 7 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session. So please prepare your questions. You can also address them here and also send by Twitter account to Lea account, and we will try to address them. So Dr. Bartels, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Maris. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to be here today to share with you a few ideas and suggestions about European defense. In the last decade, CSDP is the weakest link in our project of European integration. The Lisbon Treaty permits many more common defense activities. Sometimes people need a crisis to make real progress. Today, we have more than one crisis in the east of Europe between Russia and Ukraine, and between Russia and our eastern allies. Russia is a threat again. We have a crisis to our southeast, caused by the jihadi totalitarianism of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and Libya. The legacy of the Arab Spring is, as we see, chaos, civil war, and authoritarian regimes. That is what the European neighborhood looks like today. We have the Brexit crisis and the transatlantic Trump crisis. And we all share the same economic problems. None of the EU countries really want to spend much more money on their military. Germany is far away from spending 2% of our GDP for defense. Maybe we will reach 1.5%. Today it's 1.2%. That is why the European Union has to become much, much more effective and united in defense. The 28 EU member states of today allocate a total of 200 billion euros to defense each year. This is a huge amount of money, 3 times as much, for example, as Russia's budget, official defense budget is. But we have 28 different national budgets that do not make effective use of this money. The 28 EU states employ 1.5 million military personnel altogether, 1.5 million, more than the United States of America. But is this huge army of 1.5 million servicemen and women visible anywhere? What do they do? And do we ourselves believe that we are strong? Do others think we are invincible, powerful? No, I don't think anyone believes that. Does that mean we need now 3 million soldiers? No. Does that mean we need 400 billion euros each year? No. We need some more personnel and some more money. But what we need most urgently is we need greater effectiveness. That means more interoperability, more standards in training, more standards for our equipment, more unified command structures, more division of labor, more real integration. The coalition agreement for the current German government, where the SPD, that's my party, is part of, but in the next months that will be a new coalition. The coalition agreement for the current German government explains what this process could lead to in the end. A European army. Not in the next 4 years, but in 1 generation. And I think, and I hope, that the next German government will share the same vision. Germany is prepared to merge its armed forces, the Bundeswehr, with the armed forces of our European neighbors, friends and allies. Will this happen overnight? No. It will take 2 or 3 decades, just like the creation of a common currency, the euro. And will everyone join in? No. Just as with the euro, many countries will want to join in the project, but no one will have to. The EU project of integration is called PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation. Until the end of this year, we will see some 20 EU member states joining in, I think, and today more than 20 did sign the treaty. It's just the very day of the beginning of a new start. Of the 28 EU member states, 22 are members of NATO as well. Action to improve Europe's defense would simultaneously enhance the credibility of our transatlantic alliance. It's the European pillar of NATO that has to be strengthened. And there is a NATO project too to strengthen the Europeans in NATO, the so-called Framework Nations concept. There is no conflict between NATO and the EU's defense policy. NATO and the EU are not competing against each other. Certainly, they are no rivals. The US and the EU can complement each other within NATO. There are tasks the US carries out that are not NATO tasks. In East Asia, for instance, think about North Korea and China. There are tasks Europe carries out that are not NATO tasks. In Africa, for instance, think about Mali or Libya. Then there are shared tasks that America and Europe carry out within NATO. That is the collective defense of Europe. NATO could be stronger if Europe would be stronger. This prompts the following 5 demands. Firstly, we need our own military headquarters in Europe. Secondly, we need a defense commissioner in the European Commission. Thirdly, we need a formally distinct Council of European Union defense ministers, instead of them meeting in the defense format of the Foreign Affairs Council. Fourthly, we need a dedicated defense committee at the European Parliament, instead of a subcommittee of the EU's Committee on Foreign Affairs. Fifthly, we need more multinational arrangements that bring together our individual armed forces, such as a joint admiralty formed by the Netherlands and Belgium, such as the European Air Transport Command at Eindhoven, such as the integration of the Dutch Air Mobile Brigade into the German Rapid Response Forces Division. We are not standing at square one. We have already made a start. The European Security Strategy, ESS, of 2003 was a milestone because it established Europe's commitment to multilateralism in opposition to the US commitment to unilateralism. At that time, Europe proclaimed that it wanted to be an actor in its own right. But far too little progress has been made in the decade that followed. Today, we are facing a number of new crises. We have a good progressive EU Commission, a new global strategy, and there are new opportunities for us. Let's make a new start, or to say it in the picture you gave us in the beginning, the baby is still there, but now it's crying and growing. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Batas. Very comprehensive view on how things are and how should and could they evolve. So thank you very much. I'm sure we will return to some of the issues that you raised later in the Q&A session. But now I would like to pass on the floor to Mr. Viestur Silanieks, the Parliamentary Secretary of the Ministry of Defense of Latvia.
Thank you, Mark.
Please switch on the microphone.
Excellencies, dear guests, interests, parliamentary attaches. Actually, it's very overcrowded there. Maybe, Mars, it's possible to put some additional chairs there, no? Because I see the ambassador of Estonia still staying outside. Maybe it's possible to arrange for all.
Doesn't look like he wants to come in.
Yeah. As you told me that there will be some 7 minutes for me, so I wrote down today in the morning to be shorter. And I'll actually start a little bit more philosophically. And why? The question is, what is security? And actually, security is a feeling. And it's the same feeling as a fear. And fear is feeling or reaction when somebody has not enough information. So the question is, do we have enough information to feel secure or to feel free? And if you know your possibilities, your resources, your strengths, and at the same time you know your enemy, his possibilities, then there is no question about the fear and about security. There is only question about reaction. Badly educated or badly informed society is weak, and it doesn't know how to protect themselves. At the moment, Europeans have 2 types of fear, in my opinion. Internal security or lack of information about civil security, and second is outer or international security, what's military or defense. And they are very close to each other. So the future of the Europe is a question about how to take governments and society out of fear. In my opinion, the answer is very simple. Well-educated society, strong economy, and strong forces. The time with Iron Curtain has gone. Cold War period is only in memories, and the problem is that European governments started to live like in paradise of capitalism, forgetting that on the planet there are not only European Union, but there are others also, and others don't think the same. In European Union level, the defense is the only policy what have been postponed comparing to agriculture, energy, transport, environment, and others. It seems that everybody thought that there is some god called NATO, and it will solve all the problems if they will arise. Now the Europeans understand much more that postponing the problem is making the problem just bigger. And so what's the plan? First, make strong European Defence Union, but taking into account that we are still in European Union. So all the members should be satisfied about the system. Make strong defense industry and support small and medium companies in military industry in all member countries. This is not only a question about industry, but this is a question about trust. This is a question about involvement of our societies in security issues. And this is important for politicians to get support from voters. For example, at the moment, approximately 90% of military industry is concerned in 6 European countries. Innovations, science, modern technologies, with the support of EU Defence Foundation, standardization of equipment, and make faster chain of delivery and speed of reaction at all. Education and strategical communication, and there should be very clear and understandable rules and benefits of all that together. But there are additionally some possible risks or problems. What we see, it could be additional administrative resources or additional bureaucracy, doubling EU's and NATO, so there can arise parallel processes. But I think this problem is quite easy to solve, but it could appear. Consolidation of defense industry can cause problems to small and medium enterprises. And growth in defense budgets should be on technologies, equipment, not on seminars, salaries, or on corporate communications. And at the same time, I think that military thinking will help to structure Europe's common thinking, to structurize it more, to be much more precise, accurate, like in military. And if each country will be self-sufficient, then all the Europe will be self-sufficient. And we should understand that defense is necessary not to fight, but defense is necessary to protect European values, our people, our culture, our nature, our businesses, our dreams. And the main thing is actually we should find friends, not enemies, because enemies will fight ourselves anyway. So good friends are big value, and that's why I think this all the European movement to defense, what we see, should be mainly based on friends. Thank you. That's all shortly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seleniks, for this philosophical yet very important approach, because it allows to look at things a bit in a broader context. Thank you. And next I would like to give the floor to Dr. Aaltola, who comes from Finland. And we mentioned quite many times already during the discussion the NATO and the European Union. And quite often it is mentioned, yeah, but it's the European Union is more or less the same as NATO. But you represent one of those nations which are not a part of NATO, but are part of the European Union. So therefore we would be happy to find out more about the perspective from Finland, how things look like with the European defense security. Welcome.
Thank you, Your Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to come to Riga. This is a hub of creative thinking on many of these issues that are so vitally relevant for our states and also for our democratic communities whose vulnerabilities have been recently highlighted, for example, election security issues. As you pointed out, perhaps the Finnish case or the Swedish case sometimes is difficult to understand because it doesn't seem to accord to the ideals of end of the Cold War thinking. So we are not part of NATO. We are enhanced partnership with NATO and quite a lot to do common activities together. So the Finnish case sometimes is a little bit murky and ambiguous. Sometimes even to ourselves it might be complicated to understand what is actually going on. But that's a sign of healthy democratic debate. And the Finns are sometimes prone for strategic silence instead of strategic loudness or audacity. I teach also, I have a professorship in Tallinn and I go there quite often, so I know the Baltic or the Estonian debates quite well, and there's a difference there between the Finnish and Baltic strategic cultures when it comes to discussing security matters. We tend to be a little bit more silent. Geographically speaking, it might be due to certain things. For example, the fact that we share 13,000 kilometers, 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia. And also when it comes to the history of defense-related developments in the region lately. One additional thing that perhaps I should remind you is that kind of the more pragmatic approach very much en vogue in Helsinki has to do with the contingencies of events. So events are the drivers of actual situations. So what you need to do in order to be prepared for those, you need to have kind of nested networks that you have actually practiced, military networks. And that has been kind of the key to understanding the Finnish defense policies. So independent defense, taking care of one's own lot, and then exercising, developing different activities in case of certain events might arise. Perhaps from this perspective, it's understandable that the Finnish kind of planning for different contingencies has also been highlighting recently hybrid warfare. Different hybridities, the actual crises are going to break out as a surprise. They have a path that is going to be at least somewhat unanticipated. That's what the enemy usually thinks. So it's not going to happen as we thought it might happen. And because of that, the events as drivers are going to be testing alliances and partnerships as well. The enemy activity is going to be designed in that manner. So that might be one of the reasons why Finland decided to establish this Center of Excellence for Hybrid Operations in Helsinki, which is done in cooperation with the European Union and also with NATO. So the Finnish thinking is the more the merrier. The more you have these defense networks and you actually practice them and you actually develop military capabilities based on them, then the more you have freedom to maneuver when a crisis breaks out. So it's not a question of signatures in papers, but it's actually developing different policies in cooperation with your partners. The Finnish President Sauli Niinistö framed this in last February when he said in the opening of Finnish Parliament that then if crisis breaks out, Finland is going to be a strong partner. And of course he referred to the different partnerships that Finland has been developing. The main ones are with Sweden that according to declarations doesn't have any limits. And then of course the cooperation with the direct cooperation with the US. And then different other arrangements like the Northern Group with UK. So there's quite a lot of activity happening there, and this European Union track has been also very important, as our chair pointed out, that option is very much available for a country like Finland. So credibility, you need to have credible solutions, and the Finnish idea has been that we have maintained our defense capabilities. Finnish armed forces are in certain ways among the big ones in Europe, and of course that's needed because of the large territory that needs to be covered. So when you take care of your own lot, you get credibility and recognition. It builds up the deterrence and also helps your neighbors that might not have similar type of capabilities. So mosaic of defense networks and European Union initiative is very much welcomed and supported by Finland. That's how I perceive the Helsinki attitude to be right now, when the great power characteristic of geopolitics is again highlighted perhaps much more than before, and Finland being extremely sensitive and vulnerable for great power politics. There's a need to be active in this respect, and I think this has been seen in Finland for multiple years already. So thank you.
So, thank you, Dr. Atola, for the perspective from Finland. And last but not least, we have a representative from Estonia, Mr. Ingvar Pärnamäe, who heads the Estonian Defense Industry Association. And what is important to mention that Estonia is currently holding the chair of the presidency of the Council of the European Union, and industry is also something very significant, because usually in the Western world, industry is that produces the stuff for the militaries. And so we would much welcome more explanation how things are in Estonia and Europe in the defense and security industry.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. From Estonian point of view, I'm happy to say that the defense industry is very young in our country, as it is in Latvia and Lithuania as well. But nevertheless, it has been growing very fast over the recent, I would say, decade or so. And we have gained by now quite a number of specific niches and expertise areas where our companies are strong, such as cyber defense, robotics, border security, etc. So we have in Estonian Defense Industry Association more than 100 member companies, and that gathers majority of companies who are active in that area in Estonia. As every young sector, also defense industry in Estonia at least needs support, and I'm really happy to say that from Estonian government we have received a lot of support. Just to give you a couple of examples, we together with between Ministry of Defense of Estonia and industry, we designed the Estonian Defense Industrial Strategy in 2013. That, among other things, set the course where Estonian defense industry should go. And also it said that export is a primary priority because of the very limited home market which we have. Another example is an innovation competition which is held by our Ministry of Defense. This means, in short, that the government gives out a very small seed money for the companies who have a great idea, and they then can multiply it with their own money. And I would say that many of great products which are right now on a market from Estonia have gone out from that process. And third example is about export support. We get a lot of support from Estonian government in order to open doors in abroad, because it's very difficult to access foreign markets in defense industry, as you might imagine. We get support from our embassies and ambassadors, so all that kind of thing works pretty well. But being in a very small country, every entrepreneur realizes very soon that you need to go out from Estonia if you want to grow really bigger. And therefore, European Union and the European level has become more and more important for our companies. And if you look at the picture in Europe, then there are a couple of things we notice. First of all, you notice that the countries and their industries are extremely different in Europe. It depends on the size of the country. It depends on whether you happen to be on the eastern side or western side of the former communist bloc or Iron Curtain. For example, I know France is a big nation in the west. Estonia is a small nation in the east. But I would bring out actually Baltic countries as a fifth category even here, that they have one more problem which nobody else has in Europe, and that is a problem that we had built to our industry from the scratch. Everybody else in Europe has had a tradition which we haven't had, and that creates extra pressure for our companies and our industries to get through. Another thing you might notice in European level is that the coordination of defense industrial issues is very messy, I would say. There are many actors who deal with the defense industry, such as European Commission, which has a lot of power and money, but quite little expertise in that area. You have European Defense Agency, which has a lot of expertise, but not so much money here. You have all kind of other project coordination bodies like OCCAR, for example, and on all top of that you will have all national agencies and ministries who coordinate industrial issues, and also then NATO, which sometimes complements, sometimes competes with the same ideas. So picture is very complicated, and that is not good. Now, big changes happen in defense industry in European Union. Within last year or so, the changes have been dramatic, and I think in general they are in a very good direction. What we still need to have, I think, and this is from Estonian point of view, I would bring out a couple of things. We still lack, I think, a strategic understanding. Why do we need defense industry in Europe in general, in all these countries who form European Union? And all these questions that what, when, who, how, these need to be more answered than they are right now. Then tasks should be divided better, and this management issue is an issue which I mentioned before. That needs to be sorted out. Maybe we have to talk about, I don't know, Directorate General in European Commission about defense. I don't know. There have to be some kind of solution where you consolidate more these kind of coordination in that domain. Defense-related R&D and technology development is extremely important and a painful area. I think we need to push more here. Maybe we need to talk about European Union DARPA. DARPA is in the US an agency which centrally coordinates the revolutionary technology development there. Maybe we should have something like that also in Europe. To sum it up, I think that we need more consolidation also in industrial side in European Union. There are risks that it might be a zero-sum game in the end of the day, that the bigger take more and smaller ones don't get anything. But there are chances that these kind of balanced approach is possible, and I hope that it goes in that direction. Because after all, I think it's in European interests to use all the knowledge which is available everywhere in small countries, in small and medium-sized enterprises, etc., etc. There are there is a lot of innovation hidden behind that. And finally, also we can use the knowledge we have here in the Baltic countries more because we know how to build up things from the scratch. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Parname, for this very comprehensive viewpoint on industry and the role of industry and defense matters, and I think quite some good ideas we have. And now I think we are ready for the questions and answers session. I can remind for those who are watching us online that you can ask your questions by using your Twitter account, so write to Liam, and we will handle them. But while we are waiting, any questions online, you have the opportunity here in the EU House to ask questions. So please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and also the question. Are there any questions? There is one. So please use the microphone for the question.
Oh, that's really loud. My name is Jan Stevens. I'm a former Latvian ambassador. My question is the relationship, I guess this is addressed primarily, but not necessarily just to Mr. Bartels, but it's the question of the relationship between the EU and NATO. There's no question that, you know, they basically see eye to eye on most issues. But my worry is that there's the question of Cyprus still out there, which means that the ability of the two to actually work together may not work out as easily as one would hope, I think, under the circumstances. So I'm not sure where all that leads in terms of that relationship between the European and NATO, because I think there has to be that relationship and has to be a strong relationship, but I don't know where that's going now. The other issue is your comment about having a European Union defense headquarters. And that's just an introduction into the issue of if I can see where there's parallelism between NATO and the European Union in many areas. But over time, when you get down to the military level, you could well see that the military in the European Union side would go along one stream, and NATO could go along another stream. And there could be, you know.
Okay, so thank you for the comments. So it's about the relationship between NATO and the European Union. So they can.
But this also relates to. This is also the question of Sweden and Finland, because if they're not in NATO, then on the European Union side, they'll be more hesitant to support what NATO is doing, maybe.
Thank you very much. Impressive comment and impressive question. Thank you very much. The roll-up banner fell down. It was a roll-up banner for the Milrem, Estonian company that produces unmanned ground vehicles. So it seems that it started to operate autonomously. So apologies for this interesting situation. Are there any other questions in the room? Yes, there is one, please. There's the microphone. Please introduce yourself and the question.
Hello, my name is Emilia and I'm from the University of Latvia Institute. I have a question to Mr. Stevens. As the head speaker brought up the point that the European Union Army is something we should strive for, I have a question regarding the FAIR principle. That's kind of the core principle for the European Union. Should then the military service be compulsory for all the European Union member states? Because as we see here in Estonia and Finland, it's already compulsory, and should that be in the near future implemented in Latvia as well, in order to share the FAIR principle? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Are there any other questions in the room? No hands up. So if there are no, then we will start to answer the questions, and I will not leave anybody without a question. And I will have to ask myself, but I think as there are no questions, and I see also no questions yet online, maybe for the second panel we have some. So I'd like to start with Dr. Batas about the question that was well elaborated on the NATO and the European Union and the headquarters of the European Union.
And I don't believe in Twitter. It's better here. The Cyprus problem is the enemy of Berlin Plus. So Berlin Plus is not good to be activated as the Cyprus problem is not solved. So Europe needs an own headquarter, not only a small one. That's now part of the conclusions of the European Council. We will get a small headquarters for training missions abroad, but it's some 30 or 50 militaries, some personnel. So it's not a huge headquarters as we see it in NATO or in the US. But when you look to the European theater, we have the NATO headquarters in Brussels with an American 4-star general, commander of NATO. The same 4-star general is the commander of the US troops in Europe with an own headquarters in Stuttgart, US EUCOM. It's a big headquarters with maybe 2,000 military personnel. So why don't we have, as Europeans, a European headquarter in Europe? Why should this be doubling capabilities while our American friends double their capabilities in Europe? So there is no duplication. It's just the only chance to be more effective, to get to strengthen the European pillar of NATO. And we need NATO for collective defense of Europe. That's the task of NATO, collective defense of Europe. That's the birth of our transatlantic alliance from the beginning until now and for the future. But there are many other tasks that are not NATO tasks, that are American tasks, not our tasks, that are European tasks, not American tasks. So therefore, we need more European strategic autonomy.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mika, please.
Continue answering that question because Finland and Sweden was brought up as potential obstacles in this new forms of cooperation. I don't particularly foresee that. Of course, there's going to be issues, and there already has been issues when it comes to, for example, Turkey blocking some enhanced partnership exercises and formats. But that's what life is in European Union or in NATO. It just kind of underlines the point of that there's no final solution to security issue. That it's a process that needs to develop, perhaps multi-speed process, and it needs also additional components and networks of like-minded countries that has been taking place rather flexibly. Perhaps networks that do not strain NATO resources, i.e. Perhaps under certain circumstances are more usable than the NATO ones. That can be also clumsy and strained by bureaucratic politics. So I don't foresee that Finland or Sweden would be particularly obstacles in here. Actually, I think, for example, NATO troops in the Baltic states have been welcomed as a stabilizing factors. Of course, you need to coordinate also, but they are seen as stabilizing factors, and the effectiveness, the actual capabilities of these different types of networks and arrangements. That's the key in the Finnish thinking.
Thank you very much, Mika, for your answer. And let's go back to the queue to Mr. Vestur-Selenek. So there was a question about the compulsory service. Shouldn't be like mandatory for all the European Union countries.
Actually, every country can decide as they wish. And the main question is about speed and form of reaction. And if you have, let's say in Latvia, 2 million soldiers without understanding what to do, there are no soldiers actually. So the question is about really how they are professional, what forces do they have, and the main thing is that in European level we should, from the top decision makers, we should see the qualities, possibilities, what do we have in every country and how to use them. This is the main thing, because military is one part, but supply is another part. So the change should be taken into account together, yeah? So the question is, shortly, everybody can decide.
Thank you for your answer, but may I add one more on top of that about Latvian position towards the European Union's defense and security policy. So far it seems that Latvia has been quite skeptical about the EU CSDP because of the reasons mentioned previously, that it could compromise the Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, and that it might in fact impede things with NATO. But now, as we see that the United Kingdom, which has been also quite skeptical of the European Union's defense and security policy, it's leaving. France and Germany, they are taking up arms and moving things forward. Would this not change the Latvian position? Or maybe I'm misinterpreting what Latvia thinks about the deeper integration of the European Union defense policy?
You know, to be skeptic, it's not bad. So it means that we are reading documents and we have our opinion. To be in favor of everything, it's worse actually. Yeah? And there are some risks, as I mentioned them, yeah, and that's why I may be sometimes so skeptic, yeah. But it doesn't mean that we are against. We are just with some. We would like maybe sometimes change the rules to be much more favored to our position.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Selenek. And as Dr. Atol already spoke, but I would like still to ask a question. So usually Finland is considered something like a neutral country or non-aligned, more or less, at least. How so to say, the Finlandization policy during the Cold War period, when you tried, to engage with different powers, wouldn't this, so to say, deeper integration of the European Union defense policy compromise, the independent, so maybe I can formulate the independent path of the Finnish security policy?
No, I don't think that's an accurate description of the situation. Finland is not a member of military alliance. It ceased to be neutral country way back then, and that's very much the thinking in Helsinki. And also it's not military non-aligned because it's part of European Union. So we think that we are very much taking part in the collective efforts to secure the neighborhood. Also, of course, Finland has military capabilities because it didn't the peace dividend didn't have that much happen in Finland because of this perhaps ontological issue. We have been always aware of the territorial defense needs, and if the capabilities for that can be increased through cooperation with others, that might be beneficial for all in the neighborhood. So that's kind of the Finnish policy line. And also, if you look into the map, Finland is an island. Almost all of the lifelines of Finland move in the Baltic Sea. And of course, those need to be secured, and those need to be secured with others. And that's a fact. And that has been also realized in Helsinki. Of course, Finland has been, well, lately we hosted the Russian president, we hosted the Chinese president, and the President Niinistö visited Trump in Washington. So there has been kind of quite a lot of foreign policy activity there, and that's not. There hasn't been apparent contradiction there, at least if I look into the Finnish debates of it. If you want to look and see what really is happening in Finland, you have to check the defense policy of Finland. That's the kind of the key driver of understanding Finnish situation and Finnish role in the neighborhood, and the activity there with Sweden, with the US, with different other arrangement is what is kind of the thing that is happening. The NATO alliance and the question of that, I think that's kind of an old-fashioned debate right now in Helsinki. That's kind of a Cold War legacy thing. So you need to kind of produce something else, and in terms of producing actual security capabilities, and NATO is perhaps only the part of the solution.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive explanation. As always, Finnish defense policy has been quite complex to understand from outside, and I think you aided, our understanding this. So thank you very much. Last but not least, we would like to return to Mr. Pärnämä on the industry. So you didn't receive any question, therefore I will have to ask some. So as we know about the defense industry, usually the big countries are also big producers of defense stuff, so tanks, airplanes, different things, and usually when we think about our market, in different countries, the first thought is maybe protectionism. So let's defend our market so that nobody gets in. But in the case of Estonia, and maybe it is also something that can be generalized to other countries, is Estonia gaining and would gain from opening the, so to say, defense industry borders in the European Union, or are you losing from it? So you have the Estonian companies which can go to the other markets to operate there, and how this aspect looks like from the perspective of Tallinn.
Yeah, first of all, I think Estonia has been very liberal in every economical terms most of the time after regaining independence, and that also goes with defense industry. If you start something from the scratch, then you don't have anything to defend or protect. You don't need any barriers because there is nothing there. And if you start building your barriers too early, then it won't grow. That is simple as that. If you have a very small country with very small industry, then you need all kind of foreign links, and that is actually the main precondition in order to succeed. And that's why I think Estonian defense industry has grown that much, because what we have done is that we have said that government will not protect anyhow Estonian defense industry artificially. Of course, you need all kind of support, which I mentioned earlier, that you need sometimes politicians who open some doors with foreign dignitaries or things like that. But other than that, you don't need any custom barriers or political barriers in order to prevent others to come in. Because if you prevent that, then you cut off potential cooperation link, which might actually lead to another innovation and to the next level of product. So I think if we talk about opening the borders inside European Union, then Estonian companies would very much like to see that. And they cannot wait until they could access all these markets in Europe easily as they operate in Estonia. But it's easier to be said, much more difficult to be done, because it relates very much with national security issues in every country, with jobs and all kind of complex issues which are not so easily to be solved. And therefore, I think what now happens with Europe at European Union level, with European Defence Fund and all these kind of processes, I think this is very important steps forward in order to consolidate European Union defense industry market internally, because so far it has been on very much voluntary basis. European Defence Agency has had this kind of voluntary regime when you can list up your procurements as a country for quite many years, but it has not worked because it's voluntary, and if it's voluntary, nothing works. So it must be mandatory to everyone, equal opportunities, level playing field, all that. That's the only way how actually Europe in general also can grow bigger and grow stronger, because internal competition is extremely important in order to have and keep the pace with America, with China, even with Russia. So we need to think about these categories very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your answer to the comment, and we are approaching slowly the second panel, who will be, and then which will be led by the fantastic Edis Bosch, Dr. Bosch, who is well known in Latvia, not only as a scientist but also as a journalist. And I would also like to slowly prepare the also next panelists, Dr. Zand Kalniņš Lukaševič, Benoit de Beauville, John Maas, and Hendrik Prax. And we will have no coffee break between, so for coffee and wine you have to wait 1 more hour. But I think that it will be worth of waiting. And at this moment, I would like to finish the first panel, and I would like to join me in a round of applause for the excellent speakers.
All right, we will begin. If it gets really cold, I will close the window. Is it already cold? Is it fine? Yes, fresh air is good, I know. So let's hope no other roll-ups will explode and no other bad surprises. Well, this is a very timely conversation, and I thank the organizers, the embassies involved, and the NGOs and the Institute as well for organizing this. Because, shall we begin, guys? Okay? You're okay over there? All right. Okay, a couple of other people will join us, but nevertheless, if we could keep the conversations going, then a bit more quieter. This is a very timely conversation because as we speak in Brussels, the process is moving along, as you might know. European Union countries are currently, right now, submitting formal notifications about participation in this thing called PESCO, which we already mentioned, the Permanent Enhanced Cooperation Mechanism for Defense Cooperation in Europe. But obviously, it remains to be seen what comes out of it, because if you have followed this, and you're an audience that has followed this, I believe, the reflection process is still ongoing about what we should do about European defense. Everyone is kind of on the same page that a collection of crises over the last couple of years have changed Europe's internal and external environment, and that should change also Europeans' attitude about what we should do about our defense and security. But what exactly should happen, and what is the place of the European Union in all of this, is, as it has always been, a matter for fierce debate. So what I suggest we do, as I give the floor, as we will mirror in many ways the first panel, and in some respects probably the themes will overlap at least a bit, but that's a bit inevitable. But nevertheless, so 6 or 7 minutes to our participants here for initial remarks, and then I hopefully will see a Q&A session, a lively one. So how I would formulate the overall question for this panel is that I would like to hear your remarks and your reflections on what is going on in European defense, and where is this supposed to go? Because let us not delude ourselves. Everything is complicated in the European Union. Nothing is really easy. We are a bunch of democratic countries, and in particular with regard to defense and security, threat perceptions and strategic cultures, they differ significantly from country to country. And this, as you might know, has thus far prevented a significant deepening of European integration in defense and security. So, at the same time, there's perhaps no reason to be overly pessimistic about this, because this year in particular, we have seen a steady stream of various proposals coming from Berlin, as we have heard from the German representative here as well. I mean, staggering set of proposals, right? We have seen proposals from Berlin, we have seen proposals from Paris, we have seen proposals from Brussels coming in, and elsewhere as well, obviously, of what should happen in this area of European integration. So let us take stock of where we are from all of the different perspectives we might represent here, the different countries, different institutions. So we sit in a number of different places, and sometimes, as the old saying goes, where you sit is where you stand. So, well, let us see of whether the different places of where we sit and stand can actually come together in certain respects. And I would also appreciate if you could be as blunt as possible about the sticking points, about the dilemmas, about the crossroads you envisage in the road ahead. So, having said that, let me very briefly introduce the speakers for this panel. We have Zanda Kalniņa-Lukašević here. She is Parliamentary Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia. Warm welcome to you. We have Henrik Praks here from Estonia, another Estonian representative. Well, Estonia is a presiding country, so you get on every panel these days, and deservedly so. We have with us John Maas. He's Senior Military Advisor of the Crisis Management Planning Directorate at the European External Action Service. As one of the crises of the last few years, Brexit has been mentioned as one of those crises, one of the triggers for the debate on European defense. But at the same time, you're representing the External Action Service, so we're very much looking forward to your perspective on this. And we have Benoit Daboville here. We're honored to have you here. He is a diplomat of extensive experience in various postings, former ambassador of France to NATO as well, and currently professor at the Sciences Po. All right, so I had this very long, is it getting cold? Okay, good. Right, so we have enough air in the room to be able to get this to the coffee break. I will like to begin with Ambassador Daboville, please. If you could espouse your perspective on the direction and the dilemmas involved in this, please.
Well, I'm seated on the left, but I don't think I will present a leftist policy. We probably, after the signatory of PESCO today, there will be a lot of commentary about Europe is back on the defense security. In fact, one should not forget that there is a long road which led to that, and there has been a long work by the EU and the SDP on operation. We had 60 operations and so forth. So the question I want to try to answer is, why now this surge in European activity on defense, and how we will do it, we try to do it in the next years, because it is an incremental process. Why? Well, I think there is basically three reasons. The first one is Russia. Russia has a new strategic capability. When the Russian forces intervened in Georgia, it was a dismal performance, and they learned from that. In Ukraine, in Syria, they have shown that they have really reformed their armed forces. But they have also developed a new strategy, which is an inclusive strategy, which is not only a kinetic strategy, it is also a non-kinetic strategy. We call it hybrid warfare. It's involved, of course, cyber, it's involved disinformation, information warfare, and all that. This is not totally new. We had that during the Cold War, but NATO and EU had completely forgotten that. And for those non-kinetic aspects, the name of the game is resiliency of each of our country. And for that, EU is absolutely necessary. There are issues, we are speaking now about military Schengen. That is one aspect of the, but there is also the cyber. How can you have cyber which can affect a lot of civilian infrastructure if you don't include in the process of discussing that EU? So the EU is back very much in the business of this new strategic aspect. The second reason is that a lot of argument against developing EU defense strategy are completely fallen by the wayside. The first one, it has been mentioned, is duplication. The 3D of Mrs. Albright is absolutely ridiculous because each country has only one army which can be used for the UN, for national purpose, or for NATO. And in fact, the Berlin Plus agreement has solved, at least legally, I recognize the Turkish aspect, but has solved this issue. The second argument against was a bureaucratic argument, is will the defense, the process of defense building capacity within the EU will be competitive or even contradictory to NATO one. This is also a false argument because the coordination is working well. But there is the third argument, which was the most important. Basically, a lot of reason advance where if EU develop a defense, the US will be no longer interested. I think we are absolutely in this contrary situation. It is if the EU doesn't show that it's interested in defense, the US will be disinterested. And this is when you go to the US Congress. I was in Washington last week. It's obvious that what they are seeing is that the Europe is not doing enough, and therefore why the US will do it. Also, there's other factors. First is the priority to Asia. It was started at the time of Obama or even before, but now it's obviously that is priority number one for the US, and it will remain for years because of China growth. The second aspect is, of course, that after Iraq and Afghanistan, there's a public opinion fatigue about external operation, and there is been a lot of the mood which is a bit protectionist, and Trump during his campaign was able to capture this mood and to build on that, and it continues. So we have to, the Europeans have to prove to the US that they are serious. If not, the US will not consider us serious. There's a third aspect. That's, the EU ideology was based on soft power. Because it was a post-Cold War, and so in fact we had already a surprise in Yugoslavia, which was not so. We have to do some military action, but now it is obvious that soft power is not alone, and that the military action cannot solve all the issue. And this is very interesting to see that the EU Commission, which was really built on using its money for soft power, has now this summer recognized that they should also use its money for stabilization on military operation. Now, if we consider that there is a need for the kind of improvement in the EU defense policy, how we will do it? The first one is, of course, we had four convictions. The first one is the debate between inclusive or modular aspect is gone. The Germans were insisting more on the inclusiveness, and we were insisting more on the fact that it's the able and willing which will do. And now I think we have find, like always in the EU, a good compromise, as it is shown today with the PESCO thing. The second is that we don't need institutional change. We don't need a new treaty. We had all the instruments and since a long time, and we have only to put it into action. And the third aspect is that we have to have clear priority. And in fact, with PESCO, we have very clear priority. First, it will be binding. It is not something you can pick and choose. It will be you buy it or you don't buy it. The second is that we will have funding, and funding is the most important incentive for cooperation. The figure could be changed, but for now, the paper of the Commission are indicating about 500 million by next year. Then the objective is 1 billion. And therefore, it will mean 10 billion for the next budget. 1 billion a year is peanuts compared to most of the military budget. At least for France is 33, German is 38. But 1 billion as an incentive to help framework nation operational to increase the financing of operation is something. Then you have the research and on technology, dual capable technology will be funded in the research program. This is also new. For a long time, the Commission was not willing to fund military research. Now we have it. Then you have also the fact that the industry will be encouraged to build common action. There will be a preference for joint project. Joint project within the OCCAR or the European Defence Agency, at some time there was criticism, for example, the overcost of A400M. But I think that now the industry has learned about that, and we will do. And the things, for example, we are aiming at is the next generation jet fighter between France and Germany. And also the drone, where Europe is really has missed the point in the last 10 years and has absolutely to develop its own. Another aspect which is interesting is the Brexit. Britain is more or less 1/3 of the military capability of Europe just now. So a lot of people were asking, but you are doing that at the time of Brexit, what will be the result? In fact, all the Brits we are talking to are saying, we are leaving the EU, but we want to be in Europe, and we will be even more in the European security, even more in NATO, even more in EU military aspect, including operation. Of course, they will not be seated from the start at the table, but they are quite interested in showing that they are not, and also they have the same analysis as we are about the fact that the priority of the US now is going to Asia. There will be also the fact that the money, which the defense fund, will go to projects for European-based industry. It's a very important aspect. We have one of the major French British industry is MBDA, which is doing missile. That of course, we will continue to do that and to favor the working with UK. So it is not a problem. Now, what will be the basic point for going on this road? First, of course, is to increase the deployability of a battle group and the framework nation thing. The second is, of course, to improve the Athena process, that was a point which was blocked by the Brits, and already we have seen. Then the dual capability research and development, because we are facing to an immense technological challenge in armament in the next year, and we cannot, if Europe wants to exist in defense, it should be on board. Now, governance will also be an issue, and like always in the EU, I think the cooperation between Armament Agency, the Commission, and OCCAR will be arranged. And I don't share what was said by our Estonian friend just before. The HQ issue, I don't see the issue of the duplication. When we are doing now European operation, we are inviting the officer of all the participating nations in the capital of the country which is leading the operation. That means the people will go to Potsdam or Paris. The fact that they are going to Brussels and that they will stay permanent in Brussels seems rather logical. It was really an ideological point. I think that to have a defense DG in the Commission is something which will happen because it's normal. Of course, there will be a lot of infighting within the Commission, arrangement with Mrs. Mogherini and the Defense Agency, but those are the kind of things which we can do. European DARPA, this has been proposed by Macron. It's part of our preoccupation about Europe losing its edge on key technology. Whether it will be kind of renovated European Defense Agency or it will be something else, it's debatable. And so, now, just to conclude, first, we must develop a strategic culture within all the European countries, and I say all. That's passed also through the European Parliament. I think Mr. Bartel was absolutely right to say that we cannot have only a subcommittee, and we should have a Commission on Defense. And second, we should also have a general push for a common culture, which means first to get rid of this stupid debate about whether the eastern countries should look first to the Russian challenge and the southern country to the Mediterranean challenge. It's absolutely, we are as concerned as the Poles or the Balts about Russia. And at the same time, I think that the Poles should also be concerned about the Russian in the Mediterranean, in the Black Sea. So it's now there will be also an issue which will be cropping, which will be what to do about the regional grouping, the Free Sea Initiative, the Budapest 9, Visegrad, and so forth. We should not have we should continue to have those regional cooperation because they are natural and they are efficient because they are a neighboring country, but we should not have a provincialization of EU on that. And the last point, which is we should also develop a culture between our military and the civilian. We have been putting a lot of money now in the French university to develop war studies, and I am vice president of a think tank. We have a lot of contact, including with German foundation. We should have military people exchange. We are ready, as Macron said, to have a lot of officers from the European country in our operational structure. And in order really to develop the kind of defense spirit which we had forgotten after the end of the Cold War.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. I think the points you raised about the development of a common strategic culture is a point that might be raised in further discussions as well, because it seems to me that's one of the sticking points in development of the defense union. So I expect we might come back to that issue. I would now like to John Maas. So, which do you have the British hat on or the External Action Services hat on?
No, you invited me as the External Action Service.
Oh, right, good.
Yeah,
okay,
so,
yes.
And I'm going to stick to that.
I was just hoping for the other hat as well, but you know. Yeah. Go on.
Well, actually, I might disappoint you there because I'm one of those Brits who's very pro-European. Hence, I'm volunteering for this job in the EU. For those of you who don't know how the External Action Service is set up, there's a bit of a clue in the title. So we look externally, and I think that's quite a fundamental piece to consider when you talk about CSDP, especially when you have the debate with NATO. We are talking about external action in our case. The second thing I'd just like to highlight, when it comes to questions, I'm the chef de file for countering hybrid threats, so I've got good connections in Finland and across the water in Tallinn for cyber. And in CMPD, we look at all the horizontal issues. So we own effectively the EU-NATO relationship, we own the EAS element of PESCO card, etc. So when it comes to questions, I'm happy to go quick fire. And if I had my uniform on like today, like the good colonel, then you'd see why I like to go fast. Because I'm on sixth, a good number of the points that I wanted to raise, and I've been asked to talk about operations and missions today, really drill down into the European global strategy. Protect, respond, and strengthen capacity. So for me, the big element that has changed as a strategic planner is to draw that link between the internal and external security nexus. So what was happening in Paris so sadly today, some years back, and has happened in be it Barcelona or London or Brussels, has been this realization that when we look abroad, we see the threats, and it's been a transition for us to understand that. Now, I think we have a relatively good news story for a union that has come together, bound politically, when it comes to things like missions and operations. I'll be the first to tell you as a Brit that they're relatively small scale in the EU. I think today we have about 3,500 military deployed and about 1,500 civilians supporting about 16 operations and missions and civilian missions. The issue here, to me, is not necessarily the scale of the deployment, it's the political impact that takes place. And it is useful to have trained 10,500 soldiers in Africa or 1,000 policemen in Ukraine. But the issue for me is how is the EU then presenting itself as a security provider? And I think in this game, little by little, step by step, is a very good mantra to follow. And I think we're doing that. And when you look at the types of operation that we're deploying, be it peacekeeping, prevention of conflict, strengthening security and defence, be that in administrations in Mogadishu or in Bamako, whether we're supporting the rule of law or justice in EULEX, or whether it's a very interesting mission, say for example the one in Georgia, where we're monitoring an effective hybrid threat of borderization, be it through South Ossetia or Abkhazia. These are very, very technical and very, very useful missions that feed back into the system. So today, though, I suppose we'd like to focus on what's new and what are the challenges, and you probably want to hear my view on the challenges. I think the strength of what's new within PESCO and CARD and the European Defence Fund are such that for once we're seen to get together a little bit of the gearing, a little bit more joined up between a relationship between defence industry. But there are some challenges in there. For me, as a military officer, who is actually going to set the targets for that industry? Are they going to come from the shortfalls as outlined by an annual review of our capabilities? Is there going to be a really close crossover with NATO so that we don't end up funding defence industry that will then duplicate effort? I think that's also key. And the other thing I've learned as a budget holder, there is very little new money out there. And I think the penny is dropping with some member states that actually, when it comes to the EDF, there isn't actually a direct link to PESCO. It's not guaranteed. There will be an ability to bid for it, as we understand from the Commission. But eventually that Commission money is going to come from somewhere. And this is leading to some questions. The MPCC, the military planning and conduct capability, as pointed out by our esteemed colleague Dr. Bartels, it's very new. It's actually only half manned at the moment, and it is only, you might argue, looking after 3 training missions. But it does complement nicely the CPCC, the civilian planning and conduct capability that we've had running for 10 years, and it is growing. So I would say, look, it's a good start. It needs to grow more, and it needs member states to fund it. This is absolutely critical, because when I come back to our start point, if the political will is there to do something, you also then need the resource to make it work. And I think resource is one of those things that flows. Another area that we're looking at, and in terms of expanding and regionalisation, is trying to learn some of the lessons. So the G5 Sahel initiative, where we've put 50 million euros, Freudian slip, behind the Sahel project, will lead into an info hub. These are areas where we're trying to make sure that little by little, instead of doing pinprick actions, we're bringing things together with a regional approach. You know, this is new, this is good strategic planning, as I would see it. We've written a protocol to improve our decision making. This is the first time that we've managed to link Commission with Council with the External Action Service. And this is progress. People out there might look at me and think, well, surely we're doing this already. No, because the system hasn't really been designed to create this internal, external view of threats. So I think, once again, we're seeing progress made. So my last 2 minutes, the challenges. I think we can safely say that 28 member states trying to make their mind up, consensus forming is a challenge, because it quite naturally leads to compromise, as we might have seen between ambition on say, PESCO, between France and Germany. We also see, in military terms, mandates, because they have been formed by consensus, are quite constraining. So normally, as a man working in the British OHQ, I would expect a British-run mission to develop and move forward as the situation on the ground change. Well, of course, that isn't quite the way that mandates work through in the European Union. It's much heavier. The issue of caveats does cause challenges, and then I come back to funding again. Member states fund CSDP in the military format, not the European budget. So again, we have a funding issue that is always linked to moving forward. The Petersburg tasks per se are very much mirrored in where the level of ambition sits, and this perhaps is an area where we then see that these missions are missions of choice. So it is not as though you're in an Article 5 situation where you're being invaded. These are political initiatives that then need, again, to be sold within countries. So perhaps it's not always that easy in a sell if you have a mission that you're trying to launch in the Central African Republic, say, where force flow is an issue, where you are perhaps internally facing more challenges in the Baltic state, where your vision is elsewhere. So force flow, burden sharing, frameworks, these are challenges that we need to really address, I think, when we look forward for CSDP. But if I was to finish on a high, and that's where I would say the integrated approach is the EU's great strength. And as somebody looks at hybrid warfare and countering hybrid threats, the ability of the EU to use diplomacy, be that hard or soft, and hard diplomacy I would include in their sanctions regime, both economic and other forms, You've got regulation, a regulatory power, so if you want to ensure that your critical infrastructure is more resilient, you can. You've got a huge budget out there that can provide development aid, it can provide crisis response. And then on top of that, you have this crisis responsibility where you have a moral component whereby member states want to be seen to be acting, be that in the case of Ebola, be it in countering illegal migration or whatever. So I think that's where the EU really plays its hand and complements, if you might like, NATO. Another subject that I'm happy to cover in questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, sir. A very quick follow-up. Well, after the couple of years, after March, whatever it is, the date of Brexit, March 29th, 2019, well, I mean, obviously this is not something you could cover extensively, but nevertheless, how this would work? I mean, we have heard from the British government that we were leaving the European Union, we're not leaving Europe, particularly times of with regard to defense and security, we will remain involved. But well, within this whole area of ESDP that you discussed, well, what is the actual mechanism how to remain engaged? I mean, can you just give us a sense of how this could actually work?
Well, first off, I'll be unemployed from the 29th of March. So if anyone's looking for a job,
you get your pension
in pound sterling, so hopefully there'll still be worth something. So I think on the one hand, when it comes to military operations, as we've seen over the last 20 years, people get involved in conflict because there's a national interest. And for me, put aside the politics of Brexit or not Brexit, the big issues that are out there are those that really affect your population. So if you want to protect your citizens, does it really matter if you do it in the framework of EU or NATO or nationally? It's the same fundamental where there's a national interest for security and defence. I do not see the UK somehow drifting off into the distance. And equally, I'm not as negative perhaps on some of the US politics that's been out there, because I think the US has always seen to act when it's in its national interest. So for security and defence, it's absolutely fundamentally important that we all share information about radical jihadis, terrorist groups, threats to security. I mean, I think it's inconceivable that the UK would not react in some way if Finland, Estonia or Sweden, because they were not members of NATO, were somehow invaded, that there wouldn't be a British reaction. So I think I take a more steady view that in the long term, when we come to these sorts of issues, they are fundamental. Yes, there will be some politics that will play out. I think there are two sides to the coin. I think the UK needs to express what it wants to do in Europe, but equally, Europeans have to express what they want from the UK, because within there you might find some common ground. And at the moment, security and defence is not part of the first three tranches of the Brexit negotiation. So as far as I'm aware, whilst the UK has put a transitional paper out there, future options, there's been no response from the EU to that. Sorry, one last thing. The mechanism is something called a Framework Partnership Agreement run by CMPD, which we have with 16 or 17 countries. I would imagine there would be some sort of super enhanced version to bring in a partner leaving.
Well, thank you very much. Well, there's a lot of people in discussion is going back and forth about maybe something will change the direction of Brexit and stuff. We don't know, but we all hope that you'll still be employed past that Brexit date in the same way that you are now. A subtle way of saying we don't want Brexit to happen, but you know, in any case, let us involve our Estonian friends once again. Henrik Praks, please do go on. How do you see it from Tallinn's perspective? Into what sort of defense union this should involve, and what it should be and what it shouldn't be?
Okay, thank you. Speaking about EU's role in European defense, let's just remind us once again that actually historically the word defense has not had a role in the European project. EU was a peace project, not a defense or military project. And the EU is not a defense organization. The EU structures are not built up like the ones of NATO, for example. But and CSDP, although it has been around almost 20 years, it was limited to a certain relatively limited area. And for example, in European Commission a few years ago, if you would started to speak about defense issues, you would be kicked out of the building very quickly, I'm sure. But now certainly times have changed very much, and it is because of confluence of external and internal factors, threats from east, south, terrorism, Brexit effect, Trump effect, you name them. Also the defense technological challenges mentioned, because as in the last panel, as was said in the last panel, actually, we often do not understand in the Baltic countries where we have so minuscule defense industries or very niche defense industries, how important is the defense industry and defense technological aspect in the European defense dimension. So there is clearly a strong political momentum for strengthening European defense, and that is also supported by the raise of defense expenditures, because during the last few years, finally, defense expenditures have started, after a long downturn, have started to raise in European countries. In few countries, I think they are still not raising or even continuing to diminish, but in the rest of the countries, they are raising. In some significantly, mostly on the eastern flank or almost exclusively on the eastern flank, but they are also in the big players. The expenditures have started to raise. And there is an overall vision of a more military capable Europe. Now the question is, where does it fit into existing European security architecture? Because we have to keep in mind that it is not created into an empty space. Maybe some people in the European Commission, for example, who have not been dealing with defense issues before can think about like that, but in reality there is an existing European security framework built mostly around NATO. So the EU project, EU defense dimension has to fit with that. Because from our point of view, and I think from a point of view of most of the nations, the transatlantic link remains crucial for European security, and NATO will clearly remain the collective defense organization. There will be not an EU army responsible for collective defense of Europe. So we have to find angles where EU can add value, how to support the development of European defense capabilities, and through that also of a European pillar of NATO. Now, on the initiatives, a few words on PESCO, which, as you know, was launched, or another document related to it was signed today, joint notification by 23 nations I saw in Brussels, and it will be finally formally launched in December in the next ministerial meeting in Brussels. And that is a format enabling member states to take more common, more binding commitments in defense fields. It is on one hand important political commitment, strengthening political bonds between nations, but at the same time its success will be measured by real and new capabilities it can deliver. So basically the output is crucial, but also is important the input. I'm happy that, as I have seen in the documents, the PESCO declarations also reflect the need to increase defense expenditures, which is the first time, I think, on the EU level there is such a declaration. There is no direct mentioning of a 2% pledged made in Wales by NATO member states, because it's not possible, because some of the member states are not NATO members, but there is a kind of intelligence reference to that. And I think it's very important that there are more resources pouring into defense, because if the EU increases its defense ambition, the money for that should not come from the other issues, from the NATO projects, for example, but from the increase of national resources and common resources also, maybe. Few the EU defending to defense. And there is also an important issue which we should not lose from sight, is the need to ensure coherence between the work and targets which are and the work which is done in PESCO and the work which is done in NATO, for example, in the fields of capabilities, because In the end, member states have only one single set of forces, one single budget, and one single defense planning system. One specific project which has been already mentioned, but maybe in few words I would highlight it, which I think is an excellent example where EU can add value, is this project of simplifying military movement in Europe. Because freedom of movement is a problem in Europe. We have so many national borders, whereas for ordinary citizens it's easy. I mean, there is no issue of crossing borders within the Schengen zone, but for the militaries it can take weeks or even months sometimes to get the permits. Of course, there will be never a similar military Schengen zone because, of course, because of the national sovereignty, there should be national controls over other countries' military personnel movement, but there is a clear need to simplify that bureaucratic processes, because from that depends our reaction to crisis. And that's something which is primarily, I would say, in the interest of NATO and concerns us in the eastern flank of NATO. But the solution lies actually mainly within the EU. And that shows, again, a big strength of the EU, or initiatives which can be taken inside the EU. It's creating of a synergy between the military and civilian sides. So I'm happy that the PESCO project, or the once proposed project for the PESCO cross-border military transport, is one which has almost the highest number of countries already signed up. Originally 6 countries from Central and Eastern and Northern Europe proposed it, and then the additional ones, as I understand, are interested in that. But besides that easing of the customs procedures, there is also another issue to a simplified movement, and that relates, and it might be a bit trickier, but that's also extremely important in our context, is related to infrastructure, because EU is dedicating a lot of money to infrastructure projects, especially in our region. We see it everywhere. We use roads or railways, Rail Baltic, for example, still to be built, but in that process, the military requirements are not taken into account. Europe used to take them account during the Cold War, but after that they were dropped totally, and the infrastructure is built only keeping in mind the civilian requirements. Now you may have noticed that last Friday also European Commission's DG Move, Director General DG Move, published its communication on strategic mobility, which specifically mentions that there should be an investigation how military requirements could also be taken into account into common EU infrastructure projects. And I think, of course, it will be a long road, I think, with all the common funding and all the legal issues involved, but that's a very important development in that context. Lastly, final point I would like to mention is the NATO-EU cooperation. Here, in the last year or two, especially after the joint declaration issued last year, and the number of areas identified for cooperation, there has clearly been a change of culture. And this turf wars, ideological battles, which used to be issues, they at least between the staffs of organizations have disappeared. Of course, there is still this Cyprus-Turkey issue, like mentioned in the previous panel, but there is much more political will and willingness between the two organizations to really cooperate. Because why is this important? Because in whatever crisis situation we envision in for example, affecting our region, EU-NATO cooperation is a must, and it's not only applicable to our region. But in case of our region, for example, if there would ever be a crisis or conflict which would force us, our countries, to revoke Article 5, we could imagine that at the same time we would also revoke the Article 42.7 of the EU treaty, the one which France revoked 2 years ago in response to terrorist attacks. So whatever crisis or conflict starts, it will not be limited only for NATO. It will immediately concern also EU, and that's why this cooperation between the two countries is must.
Well, thank you very much for this very detailed, at the same time very blunt position taken on many of the dilemmas involved in this debate. So a couple of points I will definitely come back to in our Q&A part of this. So, Kalniņš Lukašević, so the Latvian Foreign Ministry's take on this is it? Do we agree with what Henrik says and just move to the Q&A session, or or the Latvian position has some nuances to that as well, please?
As you wish, Dr. Bosch. We can definitely move immediately toward the question and answer sessions, but let me just say that I'm really impressed to see such a crowded room in such a late afternoon, and I think it shows that the discussion is very timely indeed. So when starting this panel discussion, you mentioned that the Europe security situation is changing, and I would say that the Europe security landscape is not only changing, it has already changed dramatically, and we cannot ignore it. And definitely the internal and external challenges that the EU experiences directly affects its citizens. So no wonder that also today the citizens put the security as one of the first priorities and expect EU to deliver. For example, in Latvia, the Latvian citizens want to rely on common EU actions, and actually 83% of Latvians support the common security and defense policy. So it shows the very high prominence of the topic. So the cooperation in security and defense is a very sensitive issue for the member states. There is also a wide agreement between the member states that we need to move forward, and we need to move towards closer and more coordinated EU cooperation in security and defense area, and Latvia fully agrees to that. So actually we see that the situation has changed during the last 2.5 years. So the attitudes have changed, the strategies have developed, the decisions have been taken, and the first results already have arrived. So in this regard, the EU global strategy is the one I would like to underline once again, and it has served as a springboard that leads towards more comprehensive and coherent approach in the EU. And indeed, a good progress has already been reached since the launch of the global strategy. Today, already many times we mentioned that more than 20 ministers signed the notification for PESCO, and that's something to kind of celebrate today. I think it's very important, and I'm happy to see that also our ministers of foreign and defense, both of them signed this PESCO notification. And not only that, on Friday, the European Commission published its proposal on action plan for so-called military Schengen. And here I fully agree with my Estonian colleague that it's one of the most important projects to develop as soon as possible. So of course also there are many other things to be done, to be agreed and to be implemented. So apart from the global and EU internal challenges, I think one of the main dilemmas is reaching a common understanding among the EU member states on the concept of the CSDP future development and its integration. So therefore we foresee actually a continuation of intensive debates and actually not so easy debates among the member states on this matter. Ideas on the possible longer-term future are already touched upon in many documents and speeches, including the latest one from the President Juncker. But there are also many questions and dilemmas that remain, and let me mention just a few of them. For example, how far the CSDP integration should go? Or are we heading towards a multi-speed EU in security and defense area? And I have in mind PESCO and CARD voluntary frameworks. So what challenges and benefits would be in that case? There is also a question how we will agree on financing principles for security and defense, again, for PESCO, for European Defence Fund, including the Defense Industrial Development Program, within the next multi-annual financial framework of the EU. So it's a very important topic. And also, how do we want to integrate third countries, Norway, and soon to be the third country, Great Britain, and also EU enlargement countries in our defense policy. So these are still the topics that are not answered. So, but notwithstanding the particular scenarios, future cooperation, I think, should result in a safer, stronger, and more united Europe. And that's kind of obvious, but not so easy to reach. So to reach these goals, member states will have to commit to higher level of ambitions and solidarity in cooperation and financing of the future CSDP. And that's usually one of the hardest issues to agree on. So it is important that these discussions result in a better military and civilian capabilities for EU to be able to respond to the external crisis, to internal issues, and to play a greater role globally. So ensuring this lasting peace and security in the conflict areas is EU's joint interests. And important aspects here is fighting the root causes of instability, fragility, and conflict. And this is particularly the strength of the EU, where it can add to the NATO efforts. At the moment, EU is greatly engaged with CSDP instruments in the areas affected by crisis and instabilities. And as we know, EU is currently deploying 10 civilian and 6 military missions and operations worldwide. And for example, Latvia is contributing to 5 CSDP missions and operations. As Ambassador Daboville said that the Balts should be concerned about the situation in Mediterranean as well. I would like to say that we are, and not only we are concerned, but we are contributing to the efforts to stabilize the situation in Mediterranean. And for example, Latvia is taking part in Operation Sophia in Mediterranean, and that's just one of the examples. So I think combining the efforts of all the member states can really bring good results. So we see that the EU is taking important steps forward. Member states work together with the EU institutions in jointly to jointly work for the research area, also to develop capabilities, etc., etc. And of course, there is always a question about the cooperation and level of cooperation with NATO. And I know that there are many in Latvia and in Europe and in America who are concerned whether increasing defense cooperation in Europe somehow undermines NATO. But so let me be very clear, NATO definitely remains the cornerstone of the European defense, just like it has been for almost 70 years already. We do not create another defense alliances. It simply does not make any sense, and therefore I'm really surprised how long this issue will be always raised once again and once again and once again. So, but there are many challenges that do not fall under the NATO's mandate and need to be tackled as a matter of emergency and urgency, and EU can really contribute to that. So EU has proposed to implement coordinated exercises with NATO. EU and NATO cooperation can really be very important in the area of cyber defense, as also as fighting against the hybrid threats. We can do a lot together on strategic communication, as we are attacked in parallel from our not friends close to us. And last but not least, the NATO defense planning process and the EU capability development plan, I think, needs to move on in parallel. And the EU and NATO dialogue on defense industry will need to be strengthened further. So these are the areas we will contribute also from Latvia. We will underline our interests. But at the same time, transatlantic bond and NATO as a collective defense guarantor for Latvia continues to be the cornerstone. Therefore, these developing capabilities require wiser use of defense resource to complement NATO's efforts. So EU and NATO joint declaration and action plan that has been adopted last year is a very important not only document but moment of changes. And what we see that a lot has been already implemented from the action plan, but much have to be done together, and that will definitely contribute to the security and resilience of our citizens and societies. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a half an hour for questions and answers. I'm wondering, is everyone leaving already? Is the smell of coffee entering the room and people are not able to control themselves anymore? But in any case, if anyone wants to get involved, this is the moment. Please, yes. I have a question myself that I wanted to raise, but I will give you the floor, and I will hope that your question will reflect mine as well. So please, Udis, over there. So let us collect, I think, a bunch of questions, and I'll throw my own. I'll give you the floor as well. Yes, yes. Udis, please.
You start first.
What? Should I start?
Udis Libets, journalist from Latvian radio. Journalists usually have this privilege to ask some uncomfortable, probably even stupid questions, and I will use that. These two discussions, I wanted to ask, where's the external dimension coming in? Because I have a feeling that we were talking about institutional things inside the European Union, that we can't agree on terms which we all understand that we need to cooperate with NATO. We can't agree inside of the European Union who's going to pay for that, etc., etc., etc. But lately, if we speak to different experts and read commentaries, the question is that the threats are external and they are around us. And I have a question. Does European Union know exactly where the threats come from? Do they know exactly what they want to do to tackle those threats somehow? And the third question is how these threats influence the position of European Union as a global player, or can we even speak of Europe as a global player in this case? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, others, please, willing to get involved, please. Yes, over there.
Thank you. This may be somewhat similar to the previous question, but a little different take on it. As you probably all know, Der Spiegel published a leaked document that the Bundeswehr has done on various scenarios about how things will develop in the future in the European context and maybe in the world. Some of the scenarios are quite dire. And they didn't put any probabilities on each of the scenarios. But clearly, it seems to me that if the Bundeswehr has done this kind of scenario building, then they're taking the whole idea very seriously. I don't know whether they're going to publish it or distribute it to other militaries around Europe. I don't know. But the question is, you know, listening to what you have to say, it's kind of like bottom up. Well, each day we react to something, we do something, makes a little progress. But it seems to me, and maybe I've been around military people too long, they look at the worst case scenarios. And it seems to me that what the Bundeswehr is doing worst case scenario, look at how things may develop in the future. And it seems to me that that is something and that should also animate what the European Union is doing, and for that matter, what NATO is doing. But is there a kind of a joint scenario building, either in both or individually organizations, that would lead to making decisions about the sort of things that the threats that are going to be out there in the future? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Anyone else? I think this feeds into something we mentioned already before, and that is one of the elephants. There are many elephants in the room when we speak about European defense issues. But that is, I think both questions sort of touch upon it. So I will add my own twist and then address to anyone who wants to address them. Is there a common understanding of the threats, all right, and common assessment of what, or is, you know, when Emmanuel Macron really speaks, as Ambassador Abbeville as well mentioned, the creation of a common strategic culture, right? A unified perception of what are we actually looking at, and what do we want to counter, and what we want to do with all of this. Is there a sufficient degree of cohesion developing currently in the European Union? I mean, another elephant in the room, right? The United States, the role of all of it. Zan Kalnin Lukashevich said, you know, how long we will raise this question about, you know, NATO's role, and we will not build another military alliance. And I take it as a Latvian position and Estonian position as well. But at the same time, it seems to me there's, you know, lack of agreement on many of those things. I quote from Macron's speech, 26th of December. He's saying, we are observing a gradual and inevitable disengagement of the United States from Europe. So it seems to me there's a lot of, you know, still discrepancy between the different parts of Europe in terms of threat perceptions and in terms of envisioning what needs to be done and in what order. I mean, these issues have always bogged down these debates about European integration. Do we not have sort of the feeling that, you know, once again, there's a flurry of activity currently, but the degree of agreement is really still not there? Do we not have that concern? A bunch of stuff. Who wants to jump in? Yes, Ambassador.
Yeah, I think the external threat is an important question. I just want to quote what we said in the defense review. Europe is seeing a resumption of open warfare and display of force on its doorstep, alongside the greatest concentration of challenge it had faced since the end of the Cold War. So this is quite explicit. Now, on the US, I stated that Trump will pass. We have to help the adult in the room to convince that Europe is still a priority for the US. Because now the priority is Asia. From Congress to the presidency and so on, it is Asia. So we have enormous effort to go back and show that China is obviously the first priority, but that Europe is merits. So it's the idea that we should not recognize that there is change in the mood of the European public opinion. We need to that. Maybe we should not express it openly, but the French can say anything. Everybody, including in NATO, recognize that. We see exactly how it is moving in the public opinion, because the numbers, and there is it's crystallized on one issue. Europe is good on word, but not on action. So we need, the congressmen say, we need to have, where is the beef? Where is your defense expenditure? Just take one example. There is the modernization of the B-61 bomb, which is supposed to go on the nuclear element of NATO deterrence. They say we pay it. Are you ready to accept it? You know, all the time they are putting us on the defensive. We have to show that Europe is really taking care of this preoccupation. And it's why I think that when Chancellor Merkel mentioned strategic autonomy in complementary to NATO, this is not to build another alliance and things ridiculous like that. Or even, it's not about I think Juncker made a misstep by speaking of a European army. It is not that. We must prove that we are really concerned about the security in connection with the US and that we are doing things after the long period of post-Cold War things. Now, I want also to mention Turkey. Turkey is an issue for NATO much more than the EU-NATO cooperation. There's a long time that we have lived with the Turkish Cypriot things. Brexit. Macron, as Tusk, have said openly, but we hope that in a few years the UK will go back after the Brexit accident. It's very clear. We will welcome them, not without some negotiation, but so I don't think. And once again, we are working. We have a lot of industrial cooperation with. We have a Lancaster House, where the British have put in France some of their nuclear research. So the link will not be separated. And we have said that very clearly.
Okay, anyone else wants to chip in? To the Estonian and Latvian friends, I would once again readdress this. We're using the terminology that the ambassador there just invoked. So do we at least agree, and the Germans are using this term, right? Strategic autonomy in the context of NATO, right? Is that the term you're using with reference to these affairs? So do we think that Europe should be strategically autonomous with certain, preconditions? Would you use that term in describing Estonian priorities with regard to this?
Let me first start on the issue of this American role, because I think we should do everything to prevent this American disengagement from Europe and from our region also specifically. And if you look to recent history in the last years, actually American presence, including military presence in Europe, has started to grow. It was diminished for a number of years, and now it has been growing already during the Obama, and the present administration certainly has not changed that policy. That does not mean, of course, that America would not have a global commitments, and Europe is only one theater. There is Asia-Pacific, probably number one. There is a Middle East. Unfortunately, the crises there are not going away, and America has to look at least on those three major theaters. And there is a certain generational changes going on in America. So, I mean, the disengagement threat is a real, but if we speak ourselves that there is an inevitable disengagement, I think we might end in the self-fulfilling prophecy that our American friends will one day say that, yes, you already consider that we are leaving. Okay, we are leaving now basically. And that ties me up to this issue of strategic autonomy, because I know it is part of this European defense vocabulary, and I understand maybe it has a German connection, but very much comes from a French lexicon. And that overemphasizing of this strategic autonomy issue can endanger us by maybe really leading Americans on one day saying that you have now strategic autonomy, you can take care of yourselves, and we are not needed. So I think we should speak about more strategically assertive Europe, or more military capable Europe, and we have to speak about that. But the strategic autonomy term, looking from my perspective, I would be a bit hesitant to use that.
Thank you. I think that I have repeated it several times that we see that the transatlantic alliance is the cornerstone of our security. So we want to see this to be developed. And when somebody talks about the strategic autonomy, then what I am thinking that we should not mix it with kind of self-sufficiency. And the one thing is to develop your own capacities and capabilities. The other thing is that to think that you can become self-sufficient and putting into terms of economics, it would be kind of politics of isolationism. That's not a sustainable thing. So we are definitely relying on this transatlantic link and alliance and as a basis for that. Coming back to the question of the journalist on the threats, I think it's quite interesting because usually we get questions that you are only talking about the threats and risks and where are the actions. Today we were trying to concentrate on the actions and not on so much on the threats. But I think there is definitely a common understanding in the EU where the threats come from. It's also written in the global strategy and the documents around that. And so we have definitely seen that the threats are coming from the east and from the south, and then we are kind of defining the all kind of them. Would it be both the military or we are also talking about the threats from the terrorism or risk from the migration and uncontrolled migration, and that comes together with the climate changes we are fighting against. And then we have the strategies to fight the hybrid threats and cyber threats, and also the needs for strategic communication. And I think that there is really a very united position in the EU concerning these issues. What is not so easy always is to agree which actions have to come first, and these are exactly the topics we are discussing these days in Brussels and in capitals.
John, can you get us back to a high note or something? Something optimistic.
Yeah, I think if I started with this sort of the external bit, if you wanted a bit more external, one of the elements that I mentioned that is sort of forgotten with the External Action Service is this outreach with the 143 delegations that you have around the world. If you're looking at the way that you implement your soft power and you do your future planning for development aid and where you're looking to make a difference, i.e. upstream, to prevent the crisis happening, from my experience of 3 years plus in the EU now in strategic planning, this is where we're making, hopefully, some difference. Unfortunately, when things go wrong, that's when you have to have your military input. So sometimes you don't necessarily see that dimension of what you're managing to stop through your support to the World Food Programme or whatever it happens to be. But I sort of come back to my integrated approach. When you look at the external dimension, look at the way that the EU operates. And I would say that we already have a great deal of autonomy in some of those areas. Hence, for me, very often it looks as though NATO is now coming to the EU to say, look, in civil preparedness, we need your support on infrastructure and roads and logistics and wherever, or in cyber, in supporting the regulation for critical infrastructure, etc. So there's that element. A more technical answer, and I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the gentleman at the back's name. I'm not sure if you're from Canada or wherever, but sometimes the military point of view is a bit boring, because you're right, we do like to know the detail, because actually in some of these areas, it's the detail is really important. So if you look at areas like contingency planning, which is a normal military function, the EU does not do that. We do not have a mandate from our member states to contingency plan. We do advanced planning, we have mechanisms where we look at early warning, where we can try and get into some of the elements that will react then to crisis response. So if something happens, let's say, in a country in Africa where there may be a coup d'etat, there is an immediate crisis mechanism that triggers. And then that will set policy down the road, because again, we are for CSDP, we're intergovernmental. We go to council, and then member states will tell us what they want to do. We'll provide a political framework, we'll provide options papers, and then, if we're asked to, we'll provide a crisis response concept. that then member states can decide whether they do or not. So there is quite a lot of detail behind this. And when it comes to EU and NATO, I would say that we've made a step change in the last 3 years, largely down to the leadership of both organisations. And at a staff-to-staff level, we're doing about as much as we can do, given the constraints that we have in information sharing. So there are certain words that we do not use, joint and common. So when it comes to intelligence sharing, we are restricted because not all of our member states have a security accord with NATO. That doesn't mean to say that secure material can't be shared at a staff level, but there are restrictions. So I would say that we go as far as we can. And knowing my NATO colleagues, there aren't many things out there that aren't within that confine able to share, certainly in the strategic dimension.
Just to reinforce this, that autonomy is not distancing ourselves, European, from NATO. It is a way to reinforce the transatlantic alliance, because there are many people in the US who consider that we are just bystanders and profiteers of the transatlantic, and not really assuming our burden. And that is, it is something which is difficult to convey, but it is the reality. It's the US reality, and we cannot close our eye about the fact they are criticizing the European.
Right.
I think the Americans use the word
free riders, yes.
And they've been talking about freeloading since the 1970s at least.
Right. It was not Donald Trump who invented that. Right. That's correct. Thank you. Well, I do not quite know how to finish this up. I really wanted this to be, joyful and everything. But I think it is very useful to understand that there's a will and recognized necessity to move along that path of defense union, whatever that might be. There are still different visions, but that's why European Union is European Union, right? Very, very different perspectives come together. And in the end, hopefully, good things happen and compromises are struck, and we move on. And hopefully, in this case, as I said, the reflection period really is ongoing. We're still in the middle of that. So it remains to be seen how all of these we heard. I think you once again to the organizers who brought together a very clear-cut, German positions and their here Baltic positions and Nordic aspect in that, and how it looks from Brussels and Paris and from elsewhere. And there's a plethora of concerns and positions on that, and hopefully those positions are coming closer together to a certain realization in the next couple of years. It remains to be seen. I'll conclude with that. Is there anything that should be mentioned still? No, that's fine. From the Institute, from the embassy, from all the benefactors. Give you what? The floor? Yes, please. I can also give you the microphone if you really want to.
Shortly, sorry. So since I came late, I could not miss my chance to have some concluding remarks. Just to introduce myself, I'm Andris Prūts, Director of Latvian Institute of International Affairs. I came today from Central Asia, so I have a long trip, so I have to a little bit switched. But why I'm saying actually is this. In Central Asia, we speak about the European Union as soft power, not even to use the word softy power. But of course, there are some questions and some expectations on what Joseph Nye would say about the smart power. Actually, the toolboxes of both soft power and also the hard power. And already some already progress has been made. And it was mentioned about the EU delegation there. It is about also monitoring mission, which is observing the Uzbek-Afghan border. So they are already present. On my way back to Central Asia, I had the chance, of course, to visit the former Imperial Center, Moscow, and to grab some newspapers. And because of today's event in Brussels, it was noticed in the Russian newspapers. There was a good even title for it. European Union is making the military Schengen for NATO tanks. And perhaps there is some grain of truth in this. Perhaps exactly what we are discussing here. So the military union or defense union is being noticed. There are some expectations as well. So about the perceptions from outside, it is important. So how we do our homeworks. I think it is important what we do internally. This crowd, I think, shows that there is interest behind the topic, and the crowd is even increasing. So not for the second panel, of course, but generally for these events. There are certainly challenges. Challenges, what was mentioned here, I think, many of them, including the strategic culture behind the defense thinking, the concrete administrative staff as well. So challenges are there. But at the same time, I would conclude with this more optimistic note. I think not just that the EU defense and military union or thinking is back, the EU is back. Europe is back to a large extent. Because finally we have some positive subject to discuss, and it seems that there are some integrationist projects in our mindset, what we can discuss and move forward as well. So basically, European Union is back on the cards, and defense and military and security issues are basically some of the flagship issues, or one of the flagship issues. So with this...
It is 5:30 and coffee is waiting, so... Yes.
I see the number of the stakeholders, and I will not name each of them, but I think the number of the stakeholders shows the growing interest. So there are the embassies, there are institutions, there are also the industry, so the Stiftung, the foundation, so I think it also shows the growing interest. So with this, thank you to the partners, thank you to the audience for coming.
Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you to the moderators for keeping time, not keeping time. Also to my Stanjans, I think we did an excellent job in organizing this and putting together. And last but not least, of course, thank you to the speakers, panelists for contributing to the discussion. So thank you so much. And the coffee is served.
Right, thank you.